Good morning. Today is Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. There's a famous question asked about a verse in our Torah portion. It's asked by Kuzari, by the Ramban, by others. The famous verse, one of the most famous in all of Jewish literature, the beginning of the Aseret Dibros, the Ten Commandments. This is where God is introducing himself not only to the Jewish people, but to mankind in a public manner as never happened before and has never happened since. And the way God chooses to introduce himself is so interesting. He says to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. Asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And all these commentators ask, if this is the way that God is introducing himself for the first time and for all time, not only to the Jewish people, but also to the entire world, why does God describe himself as the one who took us out of Egypt and not describe himself as the one who created heaven and earth? I mean, yes, the exodus from Egypt is very, very important, but creating heaven and earth seems to be more of a better description or introduction or accomplishment. It's universal. Why doesn't God do that? So to try to answer that, let's start with a related question. We refer to this passage as the Aseret Dibros, and we refer to it as the Ten Commandments. Clearly, this passage, which we read this Shabbos, the Parsha of Yisro, is one of the most influential collections of words in the history of mankind. Words that hold special meaning for people of many faiths, not just the Jewish people. But here's the question to consider. The passage of the Ten Commandments, does it actually include 10 commandments? Are there 10 commandments there? We all call it the 10 commandments. Are there 10? Now, first of all, you should know that nowhere in the entire Torah or in the Talmud is there any reference to a passage in the Torah called the Ten Commandments. However, whatever the original term would be, but in translation, there is no phrase that translates as 10 commandments in Jewish classical literature. The Torah does refer to this passage as Aseret Hadvarim. Now, literally that means the 10 words, but we would understand that as the 10 statements. So there are 10 statements, but are each of those 10 commandments? It's an interesting question. Where does this phrase 10 commandments come from? So it does not occur anywhere in the Torah. To the best of my knowledge, it occurs nowhere in the Talmud. And to the best of my knowledge, and it could be that I'm wrong, I've done a little bit of research into this. To the best of my knowledge, the source for the phrase 10 commandments, again, whichever language you're speaking, but to translate it as commandments and not sayings or principles or statements, whatever it is, to say that they're 10 commandments comes from non-Jewish sources. Among the early sources that explicitly use this phrase 10 commandments, but because, by the way, and even among Christians, early Christians referred to this passage as the Decalogue. Now, the Decalogue, the word Decalogue, is a translation of Aseret Hadvarim, 10 words or 10 statements. So even early Christians did not use this phrase. We find the phrase 10 commandments in the Council of Trent, which was a gathering of Christians in the mid-1500s. So that's the 1500s. That's pretty late in terms of historical terms. Could be it was used earlier, but to the best of my knowledge, it does not come from any Jewish sources. The only Jewish sources indicate Aseres HaDvarim, 10 statements. Are there 10 commandments in the 10 statements? Well, that's a disputed issue. The Ramban Nachmanides says that there are 10 commandments, there are 10 mitzvos. And the issue depends on how you view this first line. Anochi Hashem, we know for sure there are 9. The question is the beginning, the opening, the first one. Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. Says the Ramban, that's a mitzvah. It's one of the 613 mitzvos to believe that there is a God who took us out of Egypt. And therefore, says the Ramban, there are 10 of them. So the 10 statements are, in fact, 10 commandments. Okay, that's the Ramban. The Rambam, Maimonides, disagrees with that. The Rambam says the first line, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, is not a mitzvah. It's not a commandment. It's an introduction to the next 9 statements, which are mitzvos. In other words, the foundation on which the next 9 commandments rest, and Maimonides would say all commandments rest, is on this statement. But it's like it's an introduction. It's I'm forgetting the word in English. It's a statement at the beginning. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. And because of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, therefore, I'm commanding you, God says, in all these mitzvahs. A preface, I'm sorry. It's a preface, not a mitzvah. It's a preface to all the other mitzvahs. That's what the Rambam says. Okay. According to the Ramban, that it is a mitzvah. Okay, it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to believe in God who took us out of Egypt. Fine. That's straightforward. But according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, who says this is a preface, this is the foundation on which all the other mitzvahs rest, then we need to understand what exactly is the message. Because it is this line, according to the Rambam, Maimonides, it's this line that is making the case for why we should observe all of the other commandments that follow. And I want to suggest to you that according to the Rambam, the case that God is making for why we should observe all of the mitzvos is not because God created heaven and earth. If God would have said, I am the Lord your God who created heaven and earth, and therefore, with the implication, therefore you should observe my commandments, then the message I think we will receive is God is the most powerful, created heaven and earth, and his commandments are obligatory on us. Now, we can believe that that is all true, but that is not how God chooses to phrase it. Rather, God says, I'm going to make my appeal to you based on the benefit, the value that you will get from observing the commandments. How do we know that there is benefit, that it is value, that it helps us? We understand it's fulfilling God's will when we do a commandment, when we fulfill a mitzvah, and when we keep away from a sin. We understand that. But how do we know that when we do a mitzvah, it benefits us, it has value to us? Anochi Hashem Elokecha. This is why you should observe the commandments. I'm the Lord your God, asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I took you out of Egypt. I saved you from harm. I care about you. I love you more than you will ever know. And therefore, that is why I've given you these commandments. Because every commandment that I give you, God says to us, is a continuation of that caring and love to make your life better, to make your life more meaningful, to make your life more holy. As God introduces himself and gives us the reason for observing commandments, based on what he has done for us, his care and concern for us, his saving us, that is the rationale for why we should observe God's commandments. It is true, and I'll confess it's certainly true for me sometimes. I think it's true for many of us that sometimes observing commandments seems like a burden, seems like a chore. But what this foundational preface is teaching us is that, in fact, every single commandment is a gift to us, an opportunity to us. Of course, the challenge is to see that gift in our everyday lives, even when we're distracted, even when we're stretched thin and pulled in many directions. And at first it may seem to us that doing this mitzvah is a burden, but we have to think to ourselves and remind ourselves of this verse. Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeisicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. It's for our benefit. It's to make us better. It's to make us happier. And that's why that's the wording of the first of the Aseret Dibros. So I want to expand on this for a moment. And I want to start with kind of a technical point that's discussed in the Talmud, but I think that this technical point has a deep philosophical meaning. The Talmud says that anytime there is a prohibition in the Torah, a commandment, do not do this. In order for a court, we're talking about a Jewish court, during the time when Jewish law is in full force, in order for a court to hold a person responsible for violating that illegal act, there must be two different verses in the Torah. There must be a verse that says, don't do this, and another verse that says, and if you do this, this will be the punishment. There has to be an azhara, in the language of the Talmud, an azhara, a verse that says, I'm warning you, God says, don't do this, don't steal. I'm warning you, God says, don't steal. And then there's got to be another verse that has the onesh. And if you steal, this is the punishment. Once there are these two verses, then the Sanhedrin can adjudicate a case and hold a person responsible, meting out the punishment that the Torah says to mete out for that specific crime. Why are there two separate verses needed, and why are they often in different places in the Torah? So I want to share with you an incredible insight from Rabbi Yochanan Zweig. Now, what I'm going to tell you is true for every legal system, but it is an essential part of the Torah's legal system, and that is as follows. A legal system has laws and expects its citizens to abide by its laws because they are afraid of the consequences. Don't drive faster than the speed limit because you're going to get a ticket and you could get points off. There will be consequences. But any legal system that bases its drive to compel obedience only because of the fear of punishment is doomed to fail. if the only reason I shouldn't do something is because I'm going to get punished, so I'll find a way to do it without getting punished. I'll get a machine, I'll get a device that tells me there's no police around. I'll figure out a way to get around it. The only way a legal system can be effective is if it instructs its citizens to observe the law, because not observing the law is inherently wrong and damaging to you and to society. If I think to myself, I'm putting myself in danger by doing this, I'm harming myself, well, self-interest indicates I'm going to observe that law. I'm not going to violate it. And therefore, the Torah has 2 separate verses for every single crime. There's one verse that says this is the punishment, because the court has to know what punishment to give. And we can understand the severity of the crime based on the punishment the Torah tells us. But that's not the basis that the Torah uses to get a person, to get all of us to observe the commandments. The basis is the other verse. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's not right. It's not going to be good for you. It's going to harm you. You think you're going to get away with it. You think you're going to benefit from it. No, I'm telling you. I care about you, God says. I care about you. Don't do it. It's not going to be good for you. As I said, it's true about every legal system, that every legal system has a system of punishments, but it also has to have a system of values. This is what is good for our society. This is what is good for each individual, and this is what is bad. But it's an essential part of the Torah. Laws have consequences, and laws also form values. Laws create norms and expectations. And what this pasuk is teaching us, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Asher Hotzeisicha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, I'm the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. What this pasuk teaches us is that every single mitzvah, every single positive mitzvah God tells us to do, commands us to do, and every single negative commandment God warns us not to do, it's for our benefit. It's for our refinement. It's for our improvement. And we know that because God is a God who took us out of Egypt, who cares for us, who loves us, who only wants us to be better. And God prefaces those words in order to explain to us why we should observe God's commandments. Because they establish values, because they make us better. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.